The boy had just finished school and was walking down the quiet street near his home. The afternoon sun was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the sidewalk. He carried his backpack over one shoulder, feeling the weight of his books but also the usual excitement of knowing he could relax at home soon. He smiled to himself, thinking about the small snack he would have when he reached his house. As he walked, he noticed a few classmates walking in small groups, chatting and laughing, enjoying the end of the school day. Everything seemed normal and peaceful. The boy waved to a friend across the street and continued on his way. He felt safe in his familiar neighborhood, where he had walked countless times before. Suddenly, he saw two police officers walking briskly toward him from the other side of the street. Their expressions were serious and they were speaking quietly to each other. At first, he thought maybe they were just patrolling the area. He tried to ignore them and kept walking, hoping they would pass by without noticing him. But as he got closer, one of the officers called out, "Hey, you! Stop right there!" The boy froze in place. The tone in the officer's voice was sharp and commanding, and it made him feel uneasy. He stopped and turned slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "What's your name, young man?" the officer asked. There was no smile, no friendly tone, just a demand. The boy hesitated for a moment before answering quietly. He felt a lump in his throat as he realized that something was not right. He had done nothing wrong, yet the officers were already treating him like he had. The other officer stepped closer, crossing his arms. "Where are you going?" he asked. The boy explained calmly that he was walking home from school. He hoped that being polite would help, but the officer's expression did not soften. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and took a step closer. The boy felt a wave of fear wash over him. His heart started beating faster, and he looked around to see if anyone nearby could help. Some students were watching from a distance, unsure of what to do. A few neighbors were stepping out of their homes, curious and concerned about the commotion. The officer suddenly raised his voice, demanding the boy empty his pockets. Confused and scared, the boy hesitated, not understanding why this was happening. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm just walking home from school." The officer ignored him and repeated the command more forcefully. The boy slowly reached into his pockets and pulled out his wallet, showing that he had nothing dangerous. He hoped this would convince them that he was innocent. But instead of calming down, the officers seemed more irritated. They started questioning him about where he lived, why he was walking alone, and other personal details that made him even more uncomfortable. A small crowd had gathered by now, some students filming the scene on their phones. They whispered among themselves, shocked by how the boy was being treated. Some tried to step closer to speak up, but the officers shook their heads, warning them to stay back. The boy felt even more isolated, trapped between the officers and the growing crowd. One of the officers suddenly grabbed the boy's backpack, shaking it roughly. Books fell to the ground and papers scattered across the sidewalk. The boy tried to grab them, but the officer pushed his hands away. He felt a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. He couldn't understand why he was being treated this way. He had never done anything to deserve this. A neighbor stepped out from their doorway, calling out, "Hey, that's enough. Leave the boy alone." The officers barely acknowledged the voice and continued their aggressive behavior. The boy looked around, hoping for more help, but most people seemed hesitant to intervene directly. They could only watch in silence, feeling frustrated and helpless. The boy's mind raced. He remembered stories he had heard about police interactions going wrong, and now he was living one. He wanted to explain, to make them understand that he was just a student walking home, but the words stuck in his throat. He felt small, powerless, and completely out of control. As the tension rose, the officers started speaking louder, their voices overlapping. The boy's ears rang and he struggled to keep calm. He glanced at the students filming, grateful that someone was documenting what was happening. Maybe this would help later, he thought. Maybe someone would see the truth. Suddenly, one of the officers stepped back and barked another order. The boy felt trapped, unsure of what to do next. He tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths to slow his racing heart. His hands shook slightly as he held onto his backpack, trying to gather his scattered papers. The crowd around them grew larger, and more neighbors came out to watch. Some whispered to each other, expressing disbelief at how the boy was being treated. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of fear and outrage. The boy felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. but he also felt a small sense of relief knowing that he was not completely alone. Despite the growing crowd, the officers showed no sign of stopping. They continued their aggressive questioning, demanding more personal information and making the boy repeat himself over and over. Each time he answered, they seemed less satisfied. The boy's fear turned into frustration. He wanted to run, but he knew that moving suddenly could make things worse. He thought about his parents, who were probably waiting for him at home, unaware of what was happening. He wished he could call them, but he didn't have his phone handy. He felt trapped, caught in a situation that made no sense at all. The unfairness of it hit him hard, and for the first time that day he felt tears welling up in his eyes. As he stood there, trying to remain calm, he noticed the expressions of the people around him. The students were wide-eyed, some whispering encouragement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Neighbors looked worried, their faces showing concern and disapproval. It was clear to everyone watching that the boy had done nothing wrong, yet the officers refused to stop. The boy took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He reminded himself to stay polite, to answer their questions carefully and not to make sudden movements. He focused on keeping his hands visible and staying calm, even as the officers continued to intimidate him. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, filled with fear and uncertainty. He looked down at his fallen books and papers and slowly began picking them up, trying to show that he was cooperative. The officer watching him shook his head and muttered something under his breath, clearly dissatisfied. The boy felt a wave of helplessness, realizing that no matter how careful he was, it might not be enough. The sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The boy could feel the day slipping away, and he longed for the safety of his home. He wished someone would intervene, someone who could make the officers understand that he was innocent and did not deserve this treatment. The tension was unbearable. Every word from the officers felt like a threat, every gesture like a warning. The boy tried to stay steady, but his fear and confusion were growing with each passing second. He wanted to cry out, to protest, but the fear kept him silent. He felt trapped in a situation he could not control. Just as the situation seemed unbearable, he noticed a figure approaching from a distance. The boy could not yet make out who it was, but there was something different about the way this person moved. The officers did not seem to notice at first, but the boy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe help was coming, he thought. Maybe someone would finally step in and stop this injustice. The boy took another deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He continued to pick up his books and papers, showing as much cooperation as he could. The officers continued to question him aggressively, but he held his ground, determined not to give them a reason to escalate further. He glanced at the crowd around him again, feeling a strange mix of fear and reassurance. People were watching, and he hoped that their presence would keep him safe. He reminded himself to stay calm, to answer questions carefully, and to wait for the situation to change. As he stood there holding his books and looking at the approaching figure, he felt a small spark of hope. He did not know who was coming or what would happen next, but for the first time since the officers had approached him, he felt that maybe he was not entirely alone. Maybe someone would finally intervene and put an end to this unfair and frightening encounter. The boy tried to steady himself, holding his books and watching the approaching figure. His heart still raced from the officer's sudden aggression. The street was quiet except for the murmurs of the gathering crowd, and the tension seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. He could see that the students filming were growing bolder, stepping a little closer though still cautious. Some neighbors had come further out of their homes, peeking over fences and from doorways, whispering to one another in concern. The officers continued to shout questions, their voices echoing down the street. One of them demanded to see the boy's identification again, and when the boy hesitated, unsure what more they could want, the officer raised his voice even higher. I said, "Show it now." The boy fumbled through his pockets, his hands trembling. The officer's tone made his stomach twist with fear. He knew he had nothing wrong, yet it felt like the world had turned against him. One of the students in the crowd whispered, "Why are they treating him like this? He's just a kid." Another shook his head in disbelief. The boy overheard them but tried not to react. He didn't want the officers to think he was being defiant. Still, every harsh word, every push of his backpack by the officer felt like it was tearing him apart inside. Suddenly, One officer stepped even closer and grabbed the boy's arm, trying to force him to face a different direction. The boy pulled back instinctively, shouting, "Please, I haven't done anything." The crowd gasped. Some students instinctively took a step forward as if to intervene, but the officers warned them off, gesturing harshly with their hands. The boy felt trapped, the walls of fear closing in around him. He tried to think clearly, remembering what his parents had told him about staying calm in difficult situations. He held his hands up again, showing that he meant no harm, and tried to answer their questions patiently. "I live just down the street," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm going home from school. That's all." But the officers seemed uninterested in listening. Their faces were set in hard lines, their voices heavy with suspicion and authority. The boy's eyes darted around the crowd. He could see the concern in the faces of his neighbors, the quiet outrage of the students filming. It gave him a small measure of comfort to know he wasn't completely alone, but the officer's aggressive presence was overwhelming. One of them grabbed his backpack again, shaking it roughly. Books and papers spilled onto the ground once more. The boy knelt down quickly, trying to gather them, but the officer pushed him lightly, making him stumble. The boy felt a wave of frustration rising inside him. He wanted to shout, to demand that they stop, but he knew that any sudden movement might make the situation worse. He focused instead on steadying his breathing, trying to calm the panic rising in his chest. He picked up his books slowly, one by one, hoping the officers would see that he was cooperating. Some neighbors called out to the officers, pleading with them to let the boy go. "He hasn't done anything," one shouted. "Leave him alone." But the officers barely acknowledged the voices. Their attention was fixed solely on the boy, their aggression unrelenting. The boy felt a heavy weight of helplessness, wishing he could just disappear. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the officers continued their questioning. They asked where he was going, where he went to school, and other personal questions. The boy answered carefully, trying to stay calm, but the more he answered, the less satisfied the officers seemed. They spoke over each other, creating confusion and tension. The boy's fear intensified with each shouted question and command. A student from the crowd tried to step forward. "Stop, you're being unfair," he shouted. The officers waved him away aggressively, warning him to stay back. The boy watched helplessly, wishing someone could protect him. He felt small, powerless, and exposed. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. As he continued picking up his scattered belongings, one officer noticed a piece of paper on the ground and grabbed it roughly. The boy tried to reach for it, but the officer waved him off. "I said don't touch," the officer barked. The boy froze, realizing that no matter how careful he was, it was never enough. Every attempt to cooperate was met with suspicion, every movement scrutinized. The boy's mind raced. He thought about calling his parents, about explaining to someone that he hadn't done anything wrong, but he didn't have his phone. Even if he did, he wasn't sure the officers would allow him to use it. He felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to control what was happening, and unsure how it would end. The crowd grew slightly, more students stepping forward cautiously, some whispering among themselves, others filming silently. Their presence was a small comfort, but the boy could see that they were just observers for now, powerless to intervene directly. He felt a strange mix of fear and hope, clinging to the fact that someone was watching, that the truth was being seen. The officers' voices rose again, overlapping in harsh tones. The boy's ears rang. His hands shook as he tried to gather the last of his books. He could feel tears prickling his eyes, and he swallowed hard, trying to keep them from falling. He reminded himself to stay polite, to stay calm, and to answer each question carefully. Any wrong move could make things worse. Suddenly, a small sound caught his attention. Footsteps approaching from the far end of the street. Deliberate and confident, the boy's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't yet see who it was, but there was something in the way the figure moved that felt different. The officers didn't notice immediately, their attention still fixed on him. But the boy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe help was coming. He continued to pick up his papers, trying to show that he was cooperating. The officer watching him muttered something under his breath, clearly dissatisfied, but the boy ignored it. He focused on staying calm, keeping his hands visible and not making any sudden movements. He hoped that whoever was approaching would arrive quickly. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as people noticed the approaching figure. Students whispered to each other. some pointing, others shielding their eyes from the sun to get a better look. The boy could feel their anticipation, their hope mixing with his own. The street felt charged with energy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The officer grabbed the boy's arm again, this time more firmly. The boy pulled back instinctively, shouting, "Please! I haven't done anything." The crowd reacted immediately, gasping and murmuring, their disapproval evident. A neighbor called out once more, "He's just a kid, stop this." The officers barely acknowledged them, but the boy felt strengthened by the support around him. Even if it was only in whispers and shouts from a distance, the approaching figure came closer, and the boy could start to make out the shape. Strong, confident, and moving with purpose, there was a presence about them that seemed to shift the tension in the street, a feeling that someone important had arrived. The boy felt a small glimmer of relief, as though the worst of the situation might be coming to an end. Despite the growing hope, the officers remained aggressive. They continued shouting questions, making the boy repeat himself over and over. Each time he answered, their dissatisfaction seemed to grow. The boy's frustration mounted, but he kept his hands steady and his voice calm. He focused on his breathing, trying to control the fear and panic rising inside him. He glanced at the crowd again. The students filming, the neighbors watching, all were witnesses. Their presence gave him courage, a reminder that the world could see what was happening. He felt less alone, even as the officers continued their unjust behavior. He picked up the last of his papers, stacking his books neatly, showing as much cooperation as he could muster. The approaching figure was now much closer, their steps deliberate and commanding. The boy felt a sense of anticipation, a hope that someone would finally intervene. He didn't know who it was yet, but he trusted that their arrival could change everything. The officers focused on him still had not noticed the shift, but the boy could feel the tension in the air beginning to change. He took another deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He reminded himself to stay calm, to answer questions carefully, and to remain polite. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he also felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally put an end to this unfair and frightening encounter. The boy's heart pounded as he watched the figure approach. With each step, the presence became stronger, commanding attention even before the person reached them. The crowd held their breath, sensing something different about this person. There was an air of authority, yet it was calm and measured, not aggressive. The boy felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe the ordeal might soon be over. As the figure drew closer, the boy realized it was Cena. The recognition hit him instantly, a mix of surprise and relief. He had seen him on television, in movies, and in wrestling matches, always strong, confident, and heroic. Seeing him here, walking toward a street full of tense officers and a frightened boy, made his heart lift slightly. He felt safer already knowing Cena was present. Cena's eyes immediately focused on the officers, and his posture spoke volumes. He did not shout or act aggressively, but there was a quiet strength in the way he walked, a presence that demanded attention and respect. The officers noticed him too, and a flicker of unease crossed their faces. They had been in control up until now, but something about Cena made them hesitate. The boy took a deep breath, clutching his books tightly. He felt a mixture of fear, awe, and relief. Cena reached the boy and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The touch was calm, grounding, and immediately comforting. The boy felt a wave of safety wash over him, as if someone finally understood exactly what he was going through. "It's okay," Cena said in a calm, firm voice. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, his voice catching in his throat. He could only whisper, "Thank you." Cena's presence alone seemed to shift the energy of the street. The crowd watched in awe, sensing that someone had finally arrived to protect the boy. The officers still stood their ground, but their earlier aggression seemed to falter. Cena spoke to them, his voice steady and commanding, but not yelling. "Explain why you are harassing this child. There is no reason for this behavior. Step back and allow him to go." There was a weight in his tone, a confidence that made the officers pause. They were unsure how to respond. The boy watched, amazed at how Cena handled the situation. He had expected yelling or confrontation, but instead there was calm authority. He felt a sense of relief that someone so strong and respected was on his side. It gave him the courage to breathe a little easier, to feel a bit more in control of the situation. The crowd around them seemed to sense the shift as well. Whispers of admiration and relief moved through the students and neighbors. Some smiled quietly, others held their phones up, recording the moment. The energy in the street was changing, and the officers were no longer the only ones holding power. Cena's presence had altered everything. One officer tried to speak, stammering slightly. We were just questioning him." Cena's eyes fixed on him, calm but intense. Questioning him? For what reason? He is a child walking home from school. That is not a crime. The officer faltered, unsure how to answer. He glanced at his partner, who looked equally uncertain. For the first time, their confidence seemed to waver. Cena turned back to the boy, giving him a reassuring nod. "You don't need to be afraid. Just stay calm. Everything will be okay." The boy nodded, his hands still trembling slightly, but he felt the fear in his chest begin to ease. He felt protected, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt hope. The officers shifted uncomfortably. They had been asserting authority all this time, but Cena's presence made it clear that their behavior was unacceptable. He spoke firmly again, ensuring they understood. "Step away from him. Let him leave without further harassment. This is not how we treat children." There was no room for argument in his tone, and it carried an unmistakable weight. The boy's classmates and neighbors whispered to each other, noticing how the situation was changing. Students who had been silent now spoke up quietly, encouraging the officers to step back. The presence of Cena made them feel safer to express their outrage. Even the boy's fear seemed to lessen as he saw that others were willing to stand by him. One of the officers, frustrated and flustered, tried to argue. "He could be hiding something." Cena's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained controlled. "If he were hiding something, you would have found it by now. There is no reason to intimidate a child. Step back now." The officer hesitated, realizing that further resistance would only make the situation worse, especially with a public figure watching. The boy felt a surge of relief. Cena's intervention had created a barrier between him and the officers. The fear that had been consuming him slowly started to fade. He could feel the tension in his body ease slightly, his muscles relaxing. It was not over yet, but he knew he was no longer alone in facing the officers. Cena looked around at the crowd, acknowledging their presence without breaking his focus on the situation. The students and neighbors nodded subtly, sensing that his calm authority was reassuring the boy and controlling the scene. The energy of the crowd seemed to align with Cena's presence, giving strength to the idea that this situation would soon be resolved. The boy's mind began to calm, though he was still cautious. He kept his hands visible, holding his books tightly, but his breathing became more regular. He felt a sense of gratitude toward Cena that he could barely put into words. Here was someone who had the power to change everything, and he was using it to protect him. The officers, realizing the shift, finally began to step back. Their voices were quieter now, their movements less aggressive. Cena did not relax his stance, keeping a careful watch on them to ensure they did not escalate again. The boy could feel the tension in the street gradually dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief and security. One neighbor spoke up softly, thanking Cena. He nodded briefly, acknowledging their words without taking his eyes off the officers. His focus remained on ensuring the boy's safety and making sure the officers understood the gravity of their behavior. The boy watched him, feeling a deep sense of comfort and awe. Cena's calm, commanding presence continued to hold the situation. The officers, realizing they were out of their depth, did not attempt any further intimidation. They shifted uneasily, mumbling among themselves, clearly aware that the situation had changed and that the boy was no longer vulnerable. The boy took another deep breath, feeling a small sense of empowerment. He realized that even in the face of fear and aggression, there were people willing to stand up and protect those who could not defend themselves. Cena had shown him that courage and calm strength could change the course of events, even when it seemed impossible. As the officers finally began to retreat, Cena gave the boy a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You did nothing wrong. Remember that. Stay calm, stay safe." The boy nodded, tears welling up in his eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than fear. He had survived the ordeal thanks in large part to Cena's intervention. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the sense of awe remained. Students whispered excitedly to each other, talking about what they had just witnessed. Neighbors returned to their homes, shaking their heads in disbelief at how close the situation had been to turning worse. The boy, still clutching his books, felt a deep sense of gratitude and respect for the person who had intervened. Cena stayed for a few more moments, ensuring that the boy was calm and that the officers had fully backed down. He did not linger unnecessarily, but his presence had clearly made a lasting impression on everyone involved. The boy realized that he would never forget this day, not because of fear, but because of the courage and protection he had been shown. As Cena finally walked away, the boy took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and empowerment. He had faced an incredibly frightening situation, but he had survived it with help from someone who had the strength to stand up for what was right. The lesson lingered in his mind. Even in the face of unfairness and fear, there were people willing to protect and stand up for others. The boy straightened his backpack, picked up the last of his papers, and began walking home, feeling safer and more confident. The street that had felt so threatening moments ago now seemed calmer, and he realized that courage and kindness could change even the most intimidating situations. He looked back once, seeing the faint figure of Cena disappearing down the street, and silently thanked him again, feeling that his life had been touched in a powerful, unforgettable way. The officers finally backed away, their earlier aggression fading as John Cena stood firmly between them and the boy. The crowd, which had been tense and nervous moments ago, began to relax slightly, though eyes still followed every movement. The boy clutched his backpack tightly, his knuckles white, but he felt the warmth of reassurance from Cena's presence. For the first time in what felt like hours, he could breathe a little easier. Cena did not lower his guard. His gaze was steady, making it clear that he would not tolerate any further bullying. He spoke calmly, each word measured but firm. "You need to explain your behavior. Why were you harassing a child?" The officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. One of them muttered something incoherently, but Cena pressed on. "Step forward and answer clearly. Why were you treating him this way?" The street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for their response. The officers hesitated. Their earlier confidence was gone. They knew the public was watching, and now a respected figure had confronted them directly. We were just following procedure," one officer finally stammered. Cena raised an eyebrow, his expression showing that he was not convinced. "Following procedure? You were aggressive, threatening, and had no reason to stop him. That is not procedure. That is harassment." The boy's heart pounded as he watched Cena handle the situation. He felt small but strangely safe, knowing that someone was standing up for him. He could hear whispers from the crowd, neighbors commenting quietly on how unfair the treatment had been. Students glanced at each other, realizing that what they were witnessing was both frightening and powerful, a lesson in courage and justice. Cena continued to speak, his voice calm but authoritative. "Children walking home from school should never be treated with fear. You have a responsibility to protect, not intimidate. Do you understand that?" The officers nodded reluctantly, realizing that resistance would only make them look worse. The tension on the street slowly shifted from fear to clarity. The boy was no longer alone, and the officers had no justification. The boy's breathing began to steady. The adrenaline that had been coursing through his body for what felt like an eternity started to fade. He could feel the crowd's support around him, a quiet but powerful energy that gave him strength. He looked up at Cena, silently thanking him, feeling a sense of gratitude he could barely put into words. One of the officers muttered something about the boy possibly hiding something, but Cena's gaze did not waver. "He is a child. You have seen nothing that justifies this behavior. Step back and reconsider your actions," Cena said firmly. The officer faltered, realizing that further argument was pointless. The presence of a respected figure and the watchful eyes of the crowd made it impossible to continue the bullying. The boy felt a small sense of relief, though he remained cautious. He had been through a frightening ordeal, and the memory of the officer's aggression still lingered in his mind. But he could feel his confidence returning little by little. Knowing that he had someone powerful on his side, Cena turned his attention to the crowd, acknowledging the students and neighbors without breaking his focus on the boy and the officers. The street seemed to hold its breath, the energy shifting from tension to a mix of relief and admiration. The students who had been quietly filming or whispering among themselves now spoke up, voicing their support for the boy. Their courage grew in the presence of someone willing to take a stand. The officers finally began to step back, their voices low and uncertain. Cena did not relax immediately, keeping a careful watch to ensure they would not escalate again. The boy felt a wave of gratitude and relief wash over him. He realized that this intervention had changed everything. What had been a terrifying moment now felt like it could end safely. Cena placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder once more. "You did nothing wrong," he said gently. "Remember that. Stand tall and know that you are safe." The boy nodded, tears prickling his eyes. The mixture of fear, relief, and gratitude made his throat tight. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of control returning. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, expressing disbelief at what had just occurred. Neighbors shook their heads, whispering about how close the situation had been to turning worse. The students exchanged glances, realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The boy looked at the students filming, silently thanking them as well. Their presence had documented the injustice, ensuring that what happened could not be ignored. The officers muttered among themselves, clearly aware that they had been outmatched not just by Cena, but by the public's awareness and scrutiny. They looked uneasy, a stark contrast to their earlier confidence. Cena did not give them an easy way out. He maintained his firm presence until it was clear that they would not attempt any further harassment. The boy felt a sense of empowerment begin to grow inside him. Even though he had been scared, he had remained composed, and now he was seeing firsthand how courage and calm strength could change a situation. Cena had shown him that standing up for what is right, even quietly and confidently, could make a real difference. As the officers finally walked away, the boy took a deep breath, feeling the tension drain from his body. He could hear the whispers of admiration and relief from the crowd, and he felt a deep connection to those who had silently supported him. The street once filled with fear and tension now seemed brighter, calmer, and safer. Cena stayed for a few more moments, ensuring that the boy felt safe and that the officers had truly left. He did not linger unnecessarily, but his presence had made a lasting impression. The boy realized that he would never forget this moment, not because of fear but because of the courage, kindness, and protection he had been shown. The boy adjusted his backpack and began to pick up the last of his scattered papers. Cena offered a reassuring smile, silently letting him know that he was okay. The boy felt a mix of relief and gratitude, understanding that even in difficult situations, there were people willing to stand up and make a difference. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some still whispering excitedly about what had happened. The students and neighbors had witnessed an act of courage and intervention that they would remember for a long time. The boy walked slowly, savoring the feeling of safety, knowing that he had survived a frightening experience and that justice had been upheld in that moment. Cena gave the boy a final nod of encouragement. "Stay safe and remember what happened today. You are strong and brave," he said. The boy felt a sense of pride and reassurance, knowing that he had faced fear and come through it with courage. He nodded, silently promising himself that he would remember this lesson. As Cena finally walked away down the street, the boy watched him leave, feeling a sense of closure. The officers were gone, the crowd was dispersing, and the boy felt ready to continue home. His steps were slower now, filled with a mixture of relief, reflection, and the newfound understanding that even in frightening situations, support and courage could prevail. The boy continued down the street, his backpack on his shoulder, his books clutched tightly. He passed neighbors and classmates who nodded or whispered quietly, acknowledging what had just happened. Each step felt lighter than before, a small but powerful reminder that he had endured and survived. He glanced back once more at the street where the confrontation had occurred, taking in the memory of how quickly fear had been replaced with safety and hope. The boy's thoughts were filled with gratitude, not just for Cena, but for the students and neighbors who had silently supported him. The incident had been terrifying, but it had also shown him the importance of courage, calm strength, and standing up for what is right. He felt empowered, ready to face the rest of the day, and inspired to remember that even in difficult moments, there could be light and protection. By the time he reached his front gate, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. He took a deep breath, letting the day's fear and tension slip away. He knew that this experience would stay with him, a reminder of courage, protection, and the power of standing up against injustice. As he stepped inside his home, he felt a profound sense of relief, safety, and gratitude that would remain with him for a long time. The boy stepped inside his home, finally feeling the weight of the day lift from his shoulders. His backpack still felt heavy, not just from books, but from the memories of what had just happened. He took a deep breath and looked around at the familiar walls of his home, feeling a mix of relief, exhaustion, and gratitude. The frightening experience on the street was behind him now, but the lessons it had taught him stayed clear in his mind. Sitting at the kitchen table, he thought back to every moment of the encounter. He remembered the fear when the officers had first approached, the way his stomach had twisted as they demanded his information, and the helplessness he had felt as the crowd watched. Each moment replayed vividly in his mind, but now it was tinged with relief and hope. He had survived something truly unfair, and someone had come to stand up for him when he needed it the most. His parents arrived home a short while later. They could immediately tell something had happened. Their eyes filled with concern as they looked at him, and he quickly told them the story in as calm a voice as he could manage. They listened, horrified at how he had been treated and grateful that he was safe. The boy felt a deep sense of relief knowing he was surrounded by people who cared for him. He realized how important it was to have support, both from family and from the community. The story spread quickly among neighbors and students. Many of the students who had witnessed the incident shared videos and talked about what had happened. It became clear to everyone that the boy had been unfairly targeted and that he had faced the situation with remarkable courage. The community felt a sense of unity and outrage, but also pride in how the boy had handled himself. For the boy, the most vivid memory remained the presence of John Cena, the way he had stepped in calmly but firmly, confronting the officers without aggression, had been incredible to witness. The boy understood that real courage was not always about fighting or shouting, but sometimes about standing up calmly, with confidence, and making others see the right path. That lesson stayed with him, quietly shaping the way he thought about handling challenges. In the days that followed, the boy noticed subtle changes in how people treated him. Teachers, neighbors, and even classmates who had witnessed the incident showed a new level of respect and concern. They asked him if he was okay, shared words of encouragement, and sometimes simply gave him a reassuring smile. These small gestures reminded him that he was not alone, and that people could stand together against unfairness. At school, the boy found himself reflecting on the incident often. He realized that bravery was not just about big heroic moments, but also about staying calm and composed in the face of fear. When small conflicts arose with classmates, he remembered the lessons from that day: to remain steady, to act with integrity, and to know when to seek help from those who could make a difference. He felt stronger, more aware, and more confident in himself. His parents were deeply supportive, ensuring that he felt safe and encouraging him to talk about his feelings. They reminded him that it was okay to feel fear and vulnerability, and that facing challenges did not make him weak. Instead, it was his courage and patience that had seen him through the encounter. The boy began to understand the importance of expressing emotions, processing experiences and learning from them, rather than letting fear take control. The neighborhood began to change as well. Conversations about fairness, respect, and community responsibility became more common. People reflected on what had happened and how quickly fear could escalate into intimidation. The boy's experience became a quiet catalyst for a larger awareness, showing the importance of standing up for others, documenting events when possible, and valuing the safety of children. The boy often thought about the officers and how their behavior had shifted when faced with calm authority and public attention.